Imagine waking up tomorrow with every memory of your life erased. You still know how to walk, speak, and breathe, but you no longer remember your name, your childhood, your dreams, your failures, or the people you love. Who would you be? Would you still be the same person? Or does your identity exist only because of the story your brain tells about your life? This question has fascinated psychologists and neuroscientists for decades, because the truth is something most people never realize. Your life is not simply a collection of events. It is a story that your brain writes every single day. Every success, every heartbreak, every mistake, every achievement, and every memory is connected into one continuous narrative that explains who you are. The surprising part is that this story is not always completely true. Your brain constantly edits, organizes, and interprets your experiences, creating meaning where there may have been only random events. Over time, you stop seeing yourself as you really are and begin seeing yourself as the main character in the story your mind has written. The reason your brain creates this story is simple. It hates chaos. Throughout human evolution, understanding the world quickly increased the chances of survival. A brain that could connect events, predict outcomes, and create meaning was more likely to keep its owner alive than a brain overwhelmed by randomness. Instead of remembering thousands of disconnected moments, your mind links them together into a narrative that feels logical. Imagine reading a novel where every chapter is shuffled into random order. The story would make no sense. Your brain feels exactly the same way about your life. It wants every event to have a reason, every emotion to have an explanation, and every experience to fit into a larger picture. Even when reality is messy, your brain works tirelessly to make it feel organized. That is why one painful experience in childhood can slowly become an entire belief about yourself, shaping the way you think, feel, and behave for decades without you ever questioning whether the story is actually accurate. One of the most fascinating discoveries in psychology is that your brain does not store memories like a video camera. Most people imagine that memories are permanent recordings hidden somewhere inside the mind, waiting to be replayed exactly as they happened. But neuroscience tells a very different story. Every time you remember something, your brain reconstructs that memory instead of simply replaying it. It is almost like opening an old document on your computer, making a few small edits without realizing it, and saving it again. Tiny details change. Emotions become stronger or weaker. Some moments fade while others become exaggerated. After years of repeating the same memory, you may no longer remember the original event. You remember the latest version your brain has created. This means your life story is constantly being rewritten, not because you're lying to yourself, but because your brain naturally updates This process creates what psychologists call a narrative identity, the internal story that explains your past, defines your present, and predicts your future. Imagine two people who experience exactly the same failure. Both lose their first business after months of hard work. One person tells themselves, "I failed because I'm not smart enough." The other says, "I failed because I still have more to learn." The event is identical, but the story is completely different. Years later, the first person may avoid every future opportunity because their brain now believes failure is part of their identity. The second person becomes stronger because their brain interprets failure as education rather than proof of weakness. This is why the meaning you assign to an experience often matters more than the experience itself. Your brain does not simply remember what happened. It remembers what the event meant. Over time, these stories quietly shape every decision you make. If your inner narrative says, "I'm not confident," you'll hesitate before speaking in meetings, meeting new people, or chasing opportunities. If your story says, "People always leave me," your brain becomes extremely sensitive to rejection. It begins searching for evidence that supports the story even when none exists. A delayed text message suddenly feels like abandonment. A small disagreement feels like the end of a relationship. Without realizing it, you start behaving according to the story you've been repeating for years. This creates a dangerous cycle known as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Your beliefs influence your behavior. Your behavior influences your results, and those results strengthen the original belief. Eventually, the story becomes so familiar that it no longer feels like a story at all. It feels like reality. Modern life has made this even more powerful. Every day, social media gives your brain thousands of new stories to compare against your own. You see successful entrepreneurs, happy couples, expensive vacations, luxury lifestyles, and seemingly perfect lives. Your brain immediately begins editing your personal narrative. It whispers, everyone else is moving forward while you're standing still. But what it forgets is that you're comparing your complete life, with all its fears, failures, and ordinary moments, to someone else's carefully selected highlights. The comparison isn't fair, yet your brain treats it as truth. Slowly, your own story becomes darker, not because your life has changed, but because your perspective has. The more you compare, the more incomplete your own story begins to feel, even if your life is already filled with meaning. The good news is that stories can be rewritten. You cannot change the past, but you can change the meaning you give to it. The same painful childhood can become proof that you survived instead of proof that you're broken. A failed relationship can become evidence of growth instead of evidence that you're unlovable. A mistake can become wisdom instead of permanent shame. The facts remain exactly the same, but the interpretation changes completely. And once the interpretation changes, your identity slowly begins changing too. This is one of the greatest powers the human mind possesses. Your brain may have written your story automatically for years, but once you become aware of that process, you can begin becoming its editor instead of simply its reader. Perhaps the most important question is this. If your brain has been writing your life story for years, who is really holding the pen? Most people assume that the story is finished. They believe their personality is fixed, their future is already decided, and their past permanently defines them. But neuroscience tells a much more hopeful story. Thanks to a phenomenon called neuroplasticity, the brain is constantly changing. Every new experience, every new habit, every difficult conversation, every challenge you overcome, and every belief you question physically reshapes the connections inside your brain. In other words, your story is never truly complete. Every decision you make today becomes another sentence in the next chapter. The brain is not a stone tablet carved forever. It is a living manuscript that continues to evolve for as long as you live. This is why two people can have almost identical pasts, but completely different futures. One person spends years repeating the same painful story. People always disappoint me. I'm not talented. Nothing ever works out for me. The other person chooses to ask a different question. Instead of asking, why did this happen to me? They ask, what did this teach me? That single shift changes everything. Suddenly, failure becomes experience. Rejection becomes direction. Pain becomes strength. The events remain exactly the same, but the meaning transforms. And once the meaning changes, the future begins changing too. Your brain follows the story you repeat most often. If you constantly describe yourself as powerless, your mind will search for evidence that confirms it. But if you begin seeing yourself as someone who learns, adapts, and grows, your brain gradually starts collecting proof for that story instead. Think about the greatest people in history. Most of them experienced rejection, loss, criticism, or failure long before achieving success. What separated them from everyone else was not the absence of suffering. It was the story they built around that suffering. Some people let painful experiences become the final chapter of their lives. Others allow those same experiences to become the beginning of something extraordinary. The difference isn't intelligence. It isn't luck. It isn't talent. It's narrative. The human brain will always search for meaning. The only question is whether that meaning limits you or liberates you. So the next time you remember one of your biggest mistakes, pause before accepting the first story your mind offers. Ask yourself whether that memory is revealing the truth or simply repeating an old narrative that no longer serves you. Remember that your identity is not written in permanent ink. You are not the child you once were. You are not your worst failure. You are not the labels other people placed on you years ago. Those are chapters, not conclusions. Every sunrise gives your brain another opportunity to write something different. Every choice becomes another paragraph. Every act of courage becomes another page. And perhaps the most beautiful truth of all is this: your life is not defined by the chapters you've already lived, but by the chapters you still have the courage to write. The author of your story has been inside you all along. The moment you consciously pick up the pen, your future stops being something that happens to you and starts becoming something you create.